Welcome to another Argument Left, where we cover responses to a variety of conservative arguments, often coming from a left-leaning perspective when we do so. If you've ever engaged in the transgender restroom debate, chances are you're familiar with this central claim. It's bad for trans kids to use the restroom that matches their gender identity. Now, this argument is often going to be worded a lot more poorly, but that's the general idea. Before we get into why it would actually be good to allow trans people to use the restroom of their gender identity, I want to address two main arguments which are often used to oppose trans restroom rights. They're looped here together because both of them suggest a kind of harm that could happen. One, guys could go into the women's restroom pretending to be trans and do bad things, and two, people in the restroom might be uncomfortable. There are a lot of different branches your discussion might go down, but we'll start with addressing what we'll call the pretender argument. So how can we address this statement? Guys could go into the women's restroom pretending to be trans and do bad things. Over the years, this has been a common argument, but each time it comes back up, there are tons of advocacy groups, school districts, police departments, and researchers who say that's just not happening on any statistically significant level. In fact, in 2018, over 200 organizations signed on to a letter that sought to dispel the myth of this being something to worry about and to support full and equal restroom access for the trans community. These organizations include the Battered Women's Justice Project, National Center for Victims of Crime, National Organization for Victim Assistance, and National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. However, your job isn't to rely on their word, and you can trust that someone else who disagrees with you probably isn't going to rely on their word either. Your job is to communicate your points effectively in a conversation with someone who holds a different viewpoint than you. Although all these organizations carry much more legitimacy than you, you're going to have to do the heavy lifting in your own conversations. Before you do any direct rebuttals, you can even the playing field in the pretender argument by giving the other person a similar hypothetical on the other side. Tell them, if we require everyone to use the restroom of the biological sex they were born with, wouldn't it be equally possible for a man to go into the women's restroom and claim he was born a woman and is merely presenting or identifying as a man, all while saying that he has to go to the women's restroom because of that requirement? Like in your hypothetical, this person is pretending so they can get into a restroom they shouldn't be in. The situation is just flipped. You should have this hypothetical in your back pocket throughout this discussion because it can routinely remind the other person that the logic behind their hypothetical works in both situations. Your entire point here is there is equal possibility of a man claiming to have been born a woman so he can get into the women's restroom as there is of a man claiming to be transitioning to a woman so he can get into the woman's restroom. Emphasize that the thing that the other person is concerned about isn't unique to allowing trans people to use the restroom of their gender identity, and can instead be equally possible in a situation where transgender people are prevented from using the restroom of their gender identity. If the other person's concern is truly safety, this can be an effective way to help them see the flaw in their own argument. Another early step you should take in trying to combat the pretender argument is asking the other person, are there any actual examples you can cite? The people using the pretender argument usually fall into two camps. Either people who see it as a hypothetical and are worried about the possibility of this happening, or people who may have heard a handful of similar instances and will use them as a reason to say that this is more than hypothetical. The question is meant to help you understand which one of those camps you'll be dealing with because there are different strategies for each. Let's deal with the former. When you ask, are there any actual examples you can cite? And they reply, well, no. You should press them that if they can't give you real-world examples of this happening, then they're just saying that we can't do something because something bad might happen. Now, if you ask, are there any actual examples you can cite? And they respond with a few cases where something similar may have occurred, you'll have a slightly more difficult task. First, you should follow this up by asking them whether the perpetrator was allowed to continue their behavior or was caught and in trouble. If they can't prove that the people got away with it in the examples, you should reply that it seems like those situations were dealt with. Next, you should ask them if they can demonstrate whether this happens more often in areas that allow transgender people to use the restroom of the gender identity than areas that don't. If they can't, press them on this. You can also put the burden on the person you're speaking with to prove that actually allowing trans people to use the restroom of the gender they identify with would lead to an increase in the number of times someone goes into a restroom they shouldn't be in, not counting use by someone who is actually trans, just in case they try to pin you down there. Basically, ask them, how do you know that allowing trans people to use the restroom of their gender identity would actually lead to a higher number of people intentionally going to the wrong restroom for some ulterior motive? Statistically, how much higher would this number be? Is there any research or data to prove that? The point here is this. If they claim, if we allow trans people to use the other restroom, blank will happen, they have the burden to prove that this will happen. The person you're speaking with might begin to see your side, but if they don't accept these points as valid, remind them of the example you should have already used to even the playing field for both transgender people being allowed to and prevented from using the restroom of their gender identity. If you refer back to that example, you should stress that these things would not be prevented from happening by banning transgender people from using the restroom of their gender identity. Now that we've covered the likelihood of something happening, let's get to some rebuttals to address the actions of the people in the pretender argument, since this ultimately is the root of the concern, no matter how likely or unlikely it might be. First, you should acknowledge that any bad action committed is indeed a bad action. This should be obvious and lets the other person know that you are both on the same page here. Assault is assault, peeping is peeping, etc. Any crime would still be a crime regardless of whether someone pretended to be trans or not to get into a certain restroom. If the pretender commits a crime, emphasize that they can be charged with a crime. If the focus of your conversation is school restrooms, emphasize that any bad behavior would still be a discipline issue, just like if it happened in any other situation. You could emphasize that any of the actions that the person you're speaking with might be worried about don't have to come just from what they'd consider to be an outsider going into the wrong restroom. Anyone can engage in sketchy behavior. A woman might creep on women and girls in the restroom. A man might creep on men and boys in the restroom. This isn't limited to someone going to another restroom. Going back to the original hypothetical, it's predicated on the idea that this pretender would get away with it, when in fact this situation wouldn't make anyone more or less likely to get away with it than someone just going into the opposite restroom, even if there's a rule against it. This leads to another argument that is closely tied to this one. This related but very important point is that policies aren't force fields. Someone wanting to go into a restroom to do something pesky or terrible won't be stopped by any rule or regulation saying they can't be there. Policies don't stop someone who intends to harass or assault. Here's another angle you could use. If the person you're speaking with is conservative and supports gun rights, one way you could help make this argument stick in their head is by relating it to gun-free zones. Saying something like, just like people claim that gun-free zones don't magically stop bad guys from carrying guns into them, rules that limit restroom use by biological sex won't magically stop bad people from going into that restroom. If they've argued this for guns in the past, they should see the logic behind it when it comes to restrooms. All of the responses we've covered so far should be helpful addressing the pretender argument. Outside of hypotheticals and whether any actual instances of direct harm happen, another argument you might hear is simply, people might be uncomfortable. While it doesn't imply as much potential harm as the previous argument we covered, it can be very difficult to move someone off this point because it is undeniable that there will be some people who are uncomfortable. This is just a fact. Your strategy here is not to argue that people won't be uncomfortable, so you'll need to take a different approach. One way to address this is by comparing the discomfort of people who don't want trans people in their restrooms to the discomfort of trans people who are forced to use restrooms that don't match their gender identity. By doing this, you can try to even the playing field and suggest that the discomfort argument is a wash, because no matter what, someone will be uncomfortable. Another response can center around just the idea of being uncomfortable. You can try to convince the other person that there are so many factors that could make a person uncomfortable with someone else in the restroom. A person who smells, is scantily clothed, dresses in a way that looks crazy, is extremely loud and obnoxious, or even is intoxicated. None of these factors that could make anyone else uncomfortable would be something that prevents a person from using the restroom. Basically, you'd be suggesting that if those factors making someone uncomfortable don't bar others' restroom use, then neither should being trans, despite that making some people uncomfortable. You could also liken this to desegregation, with there being some white people who are uncomfortable with black people using the same restrooms as them. There will be some who refuse to see the similarities between those situations, so be ready to hear, "Oh, well, those are different." If you want, you can continue down this line of thinking because the situations actually are similar in principle, or you can abandon it in favor of other arguments that might be more likely to be received. If you do continue with this one, just make sure you focus on the concept of people being uncomfortable with a trait about someone else, and you separate both situations from anything legal. Maybe a question like, back when restrooms were desegregated, should we have respected the wishes of any white person who was uncomfortable with black people who used the same restroom as them? Hopefully the person you're speaking with admits that the answer is no. Basically, what you should be trying to do in these points is acknowledge that people will be uncomfortable, but question whether it is reasonable to keep anyone out just because some people are uncomfortable. So far, we've just covered direct responses to claims that suggest some kind of harm if trans people can use the restroom of their gender identity. Now we can move on to other things that might make the person you're speaking with reconsider their thoughts or prior beliefs. The goal here, instead of poking holes in their logic, is presenting them with ideas that open them up to your side. One thing that can be helpful to do is find out if there are any situations where their opinion starts to break down. Ask the person, what should happen if there is someone who is born biologically male, but identifies as a woman, has gone through hormone therapy, dresses like a woman, and would outwardly be assumed to be a woman by most people based on all the physical characteristics they can see? Should this person be forced to use the men's restroom? If they say no, you've already demonstrated that there is a break in their belief. If they say yes, continue through the example. Are you concerned that this person would experience any harassment or violence from all the men encountered in the men's restroom? If you're concerned about safety, wouldn't the safest place for this person be the women's restroom? If you're concerned about people being uncomfortable, wouldn't this person using the women's restroom lead to the least amount of people being uncomfortable? Point out that trans people are often at risk when they use the restroom that is not that of their gender identity. They get harassed and even assaulted simply because they are transgender. There was a 2015 survey of over 27,000 transgender respondents, which found that just in that past year, 12% of transgender people were verbally harassed in restrooms, 1% of transgender people were physically attacked in restrooms, 1% of transgender people were sexually assaulted in restrooms, 59% of transgender people avoided using a public restroom because they were afraid of confrontations, so much so that 32% of transgender people limited the amount they ate and drank just to avoid using public restrooms for this very purpose, which led to 8% of transgender people having a UTI, kidney infection, or other kidney-related problem as a direct result of avoiding public restrooms. Again, all of these things happened just in the year prior to the data being compiled, and this was out of 27,000 transgender respondents. There are real, reported, and measurable dangers to limiting the restroom access of transgender individuals, and they can be mitigated by allowing them to use the restroom of their gender identity. Basically, you would want to emphasize that there are plenty of recorded cases of this happening, and these harms can be actively reduced by a more inclusive policy. If your discussion is focused on transgender students and school restrooms, you can use this same massive survey and emphasize that out of those numbers, 20% of the verbal harassment, 27% of the physical attacks, and 19% of the sexual assaults reported by the respondents happened just in schools. If the other person is truly concerned about the safety of kids, forcing trans students to use the restroom that conflicts with their gender identity seems to lead to measurable harm within schools. One thing that might happen towards the end of this conversation is an acknowledgement by the other person that there might be some exceptions to what they believed before. Really, it may just come down to which situations they think should or shouldn't be allowed, not necessarily that all situations shouldn't be allowed. Don't gloat over this or throw it in the other person's face, but be prepared to use this opportunity to question whether the existence of any exceptions means there shouldn't be a hard and fast rule preventing it. Take the opportunity to suggest that the whole idea of which restrooms transgender people can or should use is more complex than they may have previously thought. Another point you should probably bring up towards the end of this conversation is that allowing transgender people to use the restroom of their gender identity seems to fix a lot of the problems while not really creating many, if at all. You could frame it in the end as a cost-benefit analysis, comparing the many benefits to transgender people to the harms, which are rare, limited, or hypothetical. Even if the other person holds on to the discomfort argument, emphasize that the real safety of transgender people should be valued above others' mere comfort. Before I go into the outro, I want to give some advice on how you should present these points for maximum effect. If you listen to this in the first place, chances are that you support transgender individuals having full and unrestricted access to restrooms. I urge you to keep this in mind. Whenever you have a discussion or debate on this topic, your goal should be changing minds, not overcoming an enemy. It is far more difficult to change culture and viewpoints if you approach this topic just trying to beat somebody, and it will likewise be more difficult to implement good policy down the road. Be calm when presenting your arguments and rebuttals. Be understanding of the other person, especially since many opponents of inclusive transgender access simply may not have considered some of the points we went over. People often are more receptive to good ideas when they don't feel attacked, and your job should be presenting thoughtful points rather than just trying to be the victor. You can still stand up for others' rights while keeping your cool and maintaining a rational demeanor. Swaying a person can often be far more valuable than beating them if your goal is change. As always, the person you're speaking with isn't guaranteed to side with you after this, but it's always beneficial to be able to have these kinds of arguments handy. You could sway someone else who might be listening when they may otherwise have been on the fence. You could be challenging the other person with something thought-provoking that they may not have considered before, and this might lead them to move or reconsider their stance over time. You can stand firm against someone who refuses to consider another opinion or viewpoint, at least maintaining your ability to effectively support your own stance. If you have arguments you would like responses to, let me know. I would love more ideas to work from, especially if they can help you in your discussions. Thanks for listening to Another Argument Left.